Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking about technology myths and mistakes of mergers and acquisitions, and we'll be focusing mostly on the manufacturing industry, but it's applicable to all industries. And today we're joined by Steve Braverman of Coio, Taylor Rowe of OneIMS, and Joel Schneider of Liberty Technology Advisors. And we're going to hand it over to each of the gentlemen to introduce themselves. So Steve, why don't you take it away?
Great. Appreciate it, Brett. Thank you for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of the panel. So again, name's Steve Braverman. My background is primarily in telecommunications. Since a year out of college, I was in the cellular business with an agency of Cellular One. And then in 1996, saw people leaving the cellular business to get into the landline and fiber optic business as a result of the Telecommunications Act in 1996, which deregulated the local Bell operating companies, and saw an opportunity to compete specifically in the Chicago market against Ameritech and then SBC, and now back to AT&T. So built an agency in 1998 that had access to over 100 different what we called back then CLECs, or competitive local exchange carriers, to compete on the local and long distance side, and then soon to be the internet and data connectivity side, and built that business up to just shy of $100 million in revenue and 1,300 sales partners throughout the country. And while we were in the midst of the idea of selling that, we also started a carrier ourselves. So we'd have one of our own in our portfolio, which I'm a part of today, called Coio Solutions. I'm one of three partners that operate the company. And we built this company 100% over an IP-based network, no old TDM or copper infrastructure, and started with voice technology services, specifically SIP trunking, to replace old copper technologies of analog lines and ISDN PRI lines. Not to get too technical there with acronyms, and then added on from there services like SD-WAN technology that allow customers to have multiple paths of internet coming in, and full redundancy features and ways to prioritize and shape their traffic services. And then on top of that, a lot of on-premise telephone systems that are out there, which are about 75% of all businesses today still operate under, are becoming obsolete and being replaced by services in the cloud, or as we call them, unified communications as a service. So we have a large platform now that competes with a lot of the publicly traded companies, the likes of Vonage and RingCentral. And what we're using today, we compete a lot with Skype and do a lot of work with Microsoft Teams and a number of others. So today, we're 100% business focused, even though we are located in the Chicago area. We've got data centers throughout the country. We have customers, I think, in 42 states out of the country. And we're starting to generate some international traffic and decent amount of Canadian traffic as well.
Awesome. So why don't we go ahead and hand it over to Taylor.
Sure. Taylor Rowe at OneIMS. Excuse me. All right, I don't know if I have as much to say as Steve did, but I'll do my best. OneIMS, really, we focus on building custom marketing and sales programs, primarily in the B2B space. So businesses that are lacking really one of three areas, either not driving enough traffic or visibility to their website, or they're getting some traffic to their website, but they're not capitalizing on that traffic, resulting in quality leads coming into their pipeline. And then the third area of focus is, how do we maximize on leads that are generated either online or offline through years of doing business or brand new leads, and how do we convert more of them into paying customers and repeat customers, cross-sells, upsells, those sorts of things. So we help really build and design those custom solutions and systems, everything from the technology to the strategy, and then ultimately the implementation and optimization.
Great. And Joel Schneider at Liberty Technology Advisors, you want to bring it home?
Thanks, Brad, and it's really great to be on this panel with Taylor and Steve. This is going to be a great discussion today. Liberty Technology is an independent consulting firm headquartered in the Chicago suburbs with clients throughout the United States. Our mission is to help our clients be more productive and to improve their business performance. And how we do that is to help our clients evaluate, select, and implement software solutions to meet their needs, and also re-engineer their business processes. We do a lot of work as interim CFOs. Interim CIOs, not CFOs. Well, that was a mistake. And help organize IT departments so companies can be much more efficient as they go forward. Our team of consultants have tremendous experience in helping businesses run better. So our mission is to find the best software solutions, help them implement that, utilize the functionality in that software, and re-engineer their business processes so they have a good foundation, they're able to scale and grow. And that's what we've been doing for 25 years now.
Perfect. So thank you guys for joining us. Like I said, we are going to be talking about technology myths and mistakes for mergers and acquisitions. So with the three unique perspectives that you guys bring, I think it would make sense for us to ask a few questions, and then we'll just go around the horn and ask, we can have some different perspectives and obviously keep the conversation going between you guys. So to kick things off, what are the biggest oversights made by companies during or following an acquisition or a merger? By all means, if anyone wants to jump at it, go for it.
I'm sure that Steve and Taylor have thoughts, especially on the areas of marketing and digital marketing and web and internet presence, and then from a telecom perspective. But there is no secret to why so many companies make mistakes when they do mergers and acquisitions. And it's not after the acquisition. The biggest mistake we see companies do is not planning prior to the actual transaction itself. You have to do the due diligence up front. You have to understand the systems in place at the target company and your company, and you can't assume anything. So the biggest mistake we see companies do is an old saying of they assume, and we all know what happens when you assume. So you shouldn't assume the merger will just work. You shouldn't assume that merger will just create synergies. It sounds good on paper. It sounds good when you talk about it. But if you don't have a plan for it to happen and understand that a merger affects people, and remember, we're dealing with people here, and people are people. They have to understand what their role is today, the role is during the merger integration process, and the role afterwards. It's not going to work. So the biggest mistake is not having a plan, not doing discovery, if you will, on that target company, and not knowing what you're trying to achieve when you're at the end state. So there's a lot of sub-points, but just from a high level, I'll let Taylor and Steve jump in. But the biggest mistakes is not planning, not doing that discovery, and not having a vision of what you want that end state to be.
I would very much agree with what Joel just said there. And to add to it and share some personal experiences that I had going through the sale of my company in 2016. And by the way, that process started in 2014. And boy, was it a wild awakening when a company sends you a letter of intent and then the due diligence begins and they can start poking holes in your business. And it's a oh my gosh moment, which better prepares you for the next company that hopefully wants to acquire you. So, Joel, I totally agree. And one of the big things I learned, I don't know why I want to compare this to when I go to rent a car. Before they can even ask me, do I want the personal accident insurance and this and that, I decline. I immediately say that out of my mouth because I can cover it through American Express. I can cover it through State Farm or whatever I have. And when I go to Best Buy anywhere else, extended warranties, I'm always the first person to say no. Why am I talking about that right now? Because we all go into this, or a lot of us go into it thinking we don't need an investment bank or we don't need a consulting firm. We can just do this ourselves. Why should we pay somebody 5% or whatever their fee is to help broker our business? And I will tell you from my experience, all the money we paid to our investment firm was 100% worth it. And not just because they can help drive a better valuation or multiple of EBITDA or times revenue, but because of the amount of preparation that Joel was talking about when you begin the due diligence and you build a virtual data room with every piece that goes into what somebody is looking at. People that are buying companies typically have had experience buying companies before, and they're pretty bright and they know very quickly, I'm not going to say bluffing, but they can read between the lines without even seeing your financials pretty quickly on whether it's a true story or whether there's a little bit of fluff in there. And that's a make or break right there. So being prepared, and then also in addition to that, having all your key executives on board and on the same page and predetermined what it is each one of us is looking for with the exit. In my particular shared experience, I had two other partners. One was the same age as me, so we had similar paths for the remainder of our lives. One of them was substantially older and was ready to retire, so it was very different for him. And then we were selling our company president along with the company, and he had an agenda for himself because he wanted to continue on and know that whoever's acquiring him was going to be a nice fit for him and his family. So there's a lot of emotions that get involved too, and kind of like marriage and divorce, there's just a lot of things that should be laid out, and that's what an investment bank or a consulting firm can really help build that runway and say, here are the things to consider along the way. And if you haven't, you should probably do that now before we build a book and go to market.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just to say the exact same thing in terms of just preparation, due diligence, and then I like what Steve said in terms of buy-in from all of the executive team. I can only speak from our experience on the marketing side when our clients are either going through an acquisition or acquiring another organization. And for whatever reason, the marketing, the website, the marketing technology is often kind of an afterthought of, hey, we like this business, we like their financials, but don't dive into a lot of the brand equity and the actual channels that are driving those new customers. Of course, we're looking at the financials of, we like their rate of growth, we like their recurring customers, we like what they're doing from a business model. They're going to look at the technologies on, the ERP side and all those sorts of things. But they're not looking a lot at, what do we do with the website? How are we acquiring leads? Who's managing, the lead generation and customer acquisition efforts? And then as Steve said, what happens in this acquisition? Who do we lose in terms of core people? Is part of that an agency? Is part of that a key leadership that's also going to leave when you sell? Do you sell, you sell your best salesperson when you sell the organization as well? So that part is kind of an oversight and maybe an afterthought. And then when it comes down to it, because it's an afterthought and because there's all these other priorities, a lot of times it's, well, let's shut down this website because we already have a website, or let's just merge them together. When in fact, there's a lot of scenarios, which I'm sure we'll dive into here, where that's not a great idea to just get rid of that brand equity that's been built over the years.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead, Joel?
I was just going to add one little thing that I think all three of us are saying. It's easier said than done. The devil is in the details, and don't forget the details. It looks good when a company says, I want to acquire you, get all excited, but the details is where it all comes together. And unless you dig down deep into the details, it's not going to work out on the back end, which I think we're all saying.
You bring up a good point to add to what Taylor said, and so true, Taylor. Just thinking about full disclosure, we're a client of OneIMS, and the platforms that they help put us on, they've helped us really increase our Salesforce presence within our company, and tying things like HubSpot and Outreach.io into it. You are looking to sell your company or acquire a company. The integration process after the close can take 6, 12, 18 months, 24 months to integrate the two companies. And the more alikeness, is that even a word? The more likeness we have, and the more interoperability among platforms, the easier it's going to be. So if somebody is a huge Salesforce shop and they're trying to sell to somebody else who absolutely refuses to use Salesforce, that right there, like Joel just said, becomes an obstacle. So really good things to look over before starting the process.
Yeah. So along those lines, how should recently merged companies take an inventory of their technology stack, their software, their whole inventory? What's the best way of doing that, and how do they share that information?
Yeah. I mean, I think from a marketing side, and I'm sure that going to be a common thread through all of these answers, it's exactly what Steve just mentioned, is what is an absolute, we can't operate without this technology, and how does that align with the company you're acquiring or that you're merging with? Who has a more robust system? Who has a more proprietary system, right? Are these, well-known software or technology that you're using that have a full team of developers behind them, or is it a homegrown system that you've developed yourself? And if so, how much is that going to cost to retain that development staff within that merger? And are we going to continue to pay to build two systems if they're both homegrown. So that's what I would look at from a marketing perspective is start with what's a priority in terms of, operations from a marketing ops side, and then also do a full inventory of what are we paying for versus what is driving actual ROI. And if you have an integrated marketing solution, then you should be able to look at what tools are we paying for that actually provide ROI, what tools in terms of driving revenue, what tools are providing ROI in other instances like saving time or improving efficiency, those sorts of things. And then just look at how well those two organizations, are there any of those tools that play well together? And if not, then we have to start looking at, the details on contracts and all that kind of stuff.
Right. It's really interesting you bring up the question about how to take inventory of systems. So it sounds like a very simple task to do. I'm going to inventory my system at company A, inventory my systems at company B. But in reality, most companies don't even have a current status of what the technology inventory is there in the first place, whether it's a CRM system, their telecom assets, their ERP software, their warehouse management software, and hundreds of other systems that have been acquired over 5, 10, 20 years that probably they're still paying for. So the way to do it is to actually dig into the actual financials of the company, get to what the spend is, if you will, talk to the IT leader, whether it's a CIO, an IT director, whatever, and actually inventory every single system in use in the company. But the other key part of it isn't just to make that list and compare it with company A to company B, but you want to look at what contracts you have in place, because sometimes you just can't get out of a contract, and look at future spend, whether they're maintenance contracts, monthly recurring revenue agreements that you have with cloud-based software products, and inventory everything. It could be systems, it could be security software, application software, you name it. And then figure out what the plan is to either consolidate or not consolidate, because that's an option too. Like Steve said, the integration could take 12, 18, 24 months. Maybe you don't do it at first, but if you don't know what you have, you can't come up with a plan. So the task of the inventory of systems sounds really easy, sounds really basic. Most companies don't have an inventory to begin with. And what we help a number of clients do that has nothing to do with mergers or acquisitions is understanding what they actually have in place today. Because many departments in larger companies or even smaller companies will buy software that doesn't go through a normal procurement process. And pretty soon you're spending money on software that's out there that the acquiring company now has an obligation, a contractual obligation to continue paying for that may not add value to what the company moving forward even wants to look like. So the big thing is understanding what you have today. Sounds like a simple task, but it's not. And we help clients do this all the time, and it becomes an eye-opening exercise to normally the president and the CFO to say, here's what you actually have today in place.
And yes, contract expiration is so key to that too, Joel. You're absolutely correct. And I will tell you, a savvy buyer of a business already knows if it is under contract, and if there are, a 3-year contract and there's 24 months left, they're going to take that and devalue the valuation. They're going to put that back on you. They're not paying for that. And if it is a proprietary software like Taylor mentioned, and it's going to take them a data company to develop an API or whatever it is to integrate, that also is coming out of your pocket. So these are really good things to understand going into it.
And Steve, what does that look like from a telecom perspective? Obviously, you're merging organizations. How do you, probably like Joel said, most companies, unless it's the IT person, they don't have a full understanding of what their telecom tech stack, so to speak, looks like. So how do they take inventory from that standpoint? And then how do you choose, which providers we want to use, which, internal communication software, voice over IP, all that kind of stuff?
It's a great question. And there's no perfect answer, because what's going on in every industry, whether it's private equity or strategics, mergers and acquisitions. So it keeps on changing. I'll give you a perfect example. We got into a relationship with a very large UCaaS provider who was then acquired by Cisco, and that changed the entire dynamic of the relationship. So then we decided to get engaged with another one who just announced a couple weeks ago they're being acquired by Microsoft. So how does that change the equation. In this case, it's a super positive for us because, as most of us know now, Teams isn't going anywhere. It's only getting stronger, and how that plays into our environment is pretty neat. So it's difficult to have a perfect answer, Taylor. That being said, we know across the industry now, I've been in this space since 1992, and my partner Eric as well, that in addition to the big names on our wholesale fiber assets from Verizon, AT&T, and CenturyLink, we know who the others are that can get us to rural areas or on-net buildings, and for the most part, what their financials look like, and if there's some that we want to stay clear of or there's some that we want to go with. And I would like to think that most of the other companies like Koyo out there have similar strategies, and also in terms of quoting and software and fiber locator services, we're very similar. Whether you're using your CRM in HubSpot or Salesforce or NetSuite or something larger with Oracle or proprietarily built, that's when it becomes a little more of the unknown. But for the most part, there's not standardization, but the same guys are knocking on all of our doors. So we're buying a lot from the same people.
Great. So a common scenario is an SMB being acquired by a PE firm. Typically, they'll find value in the recurring customer base. What technology or digital assets should they be auditing, and how can that be valued?
That's a great question. And Joel, I bet you've got more of an answer than I do. But what I wanted to say, just because it's hot in my mind right now, is what is that customer base made up of? And that's come up multiple times. If 85% of your top line revenue is coming from 10% of your customers, then that's more of a threat to them. If you lose one of them, it can be detrimental to your revenues, versus if it's spread out among 100 or 1,000 customers quite evenly. So that comes to be a big part in the factor of valuation too. So I just want to throw that out there, Joel. I think you can probably answer the rest of it.
Yep. So whether it's a strategic buyer or private equity, it's important to know your customer base. But that really is a big question, because it really comes down to, what do you want to do with these customers? A private equity group may buy a company that sells product X, and they're buying another one that also sells company X. So do I consolidate the operations? Do I consolidate my customer base? Do I consolidate my systems? How do I leverage two companies that may be selling to common customers in a most efficient way? So this is where the whole idea of separate or combine. Am I combining parts? Am I combining divisions? Am I combining departments? What are my economies of scale? Private equity groups are different from a strategic buyer. Private equity group needs to find ways to, everyone does, but where do I drive my efficiencies? Where do I drive out cost? And how do I generate more revenue, and with an investment in usually marketing and sales? Strategic buyers need to know, how do I drive cost out of this, but how do I grow my business in general? So there's two different ways to look at this. Am I combining operations, or am I not combining operations? Do I sell to the same customer with two different companies? The classic example is, if I sell this pen to one company, but it's made by my now two companies that I bought, am I sending them one invoice? Am I sending them two invoices? What's my opportunity to upsell and cross-sell other products? But you need systems, you need data, and you need marketing to do that. And that's why you need an overall game plan to make this happen. It doesn't happen just because you want it to happen. Someone's actually got to put together for lack of a better word, the merger integration team. You have to get people on board from both companies, and people have to understand their roles and responsibilities. The governance is critical. I know, Steve, you've been through this. The governance of how this is going to be managed and decisions go through is what makes or breaks a good merger or integration effort.
And add to the economies of scale, especially with private equity versus strategic, who might be doing some kind of platform roll-up. How critical is it to you, I'll speak for myself, with the employees that helped you get your business to where it is before you're selling it? Right. I'm not selling my business so all my employees lose their jobs. I want job security for them. So that was a big piece in our process back in 2015 and 16, we wanted to guarantee that there was an employment position for every person in our business. In a private equity and a few other scenarios, obviously you need to be cautious, because if they're trying to consolidate or streamline processes and they're rolling you up with somebody that already has a marketing department, do they need the other people that are in your company? And so I'm very protective of the people that help me get to where I am in life.
Yeah, I mean, the most common scenario that we face from the marketing side is exactly what you guys explained, is the consolidation. That's where I think you really have to take inventory of everything that's going on. And just like Steve mentioned, in terms of understanding your revenue makeup or your customer makeup based on the distribution of, is it one customer that's bringing in 80-90% of your revenue? The same thing in terms of a customer acquisition standpoint and a customer sort of communication perspective, right? So if you look at these two websites, we bought, a company that I'm assuming that, if in this scenario, we're acquiring a company that is either a competitor or very similar, right? In terms of merging them together. So in that scenario, the common sort of strategy would be, well, we're a larger company, so we're going to merge the website into our website, and it's just going to be a division of our organization or something along those lines. When you have to look at what was that website producing in terms of value, and you evaluated this very similar to how you evaluate the company, right? So you'd say, okay, in terms of new leads that are coming from this source in multiple channels, we might be driving, $5 million a year worth of new business, and our, average customer stays with us for 3 years. So now this website itself is worth $15 million, right? Now we also look at retention rates. We look at communication in terms of how are we emailing these people. And then the third thing you have to look at is the overall brand equity, right? So the idea or the strategy would be, well, if we just eliminate this website, we don't have to manage two websites, and all that traffic will then just come to our main website. We'll replicate the marketing strategy, the channels, and we'll drive all the traffic to our main website. And so we're not eliminating $15 million. We're just going to funnel it through our website. That may be true to some extent, but the thing is, you have to look at something like how many branded searches, right? So one of the things we help our clients look at is how often are people searching for that brand name, which would be an indicator of how well known is that brand and how sought after is that brand, right? So how does that compare with your organization? And if we're assuming in this scenario we are a competitor to them, there's a reason that they chose to work with the competitor brand in the first place over your company. So simply just assuming that if you're going to merge the two brands, now all new business is going to go to your website and just say, okay, well, the company I was looking for doesn't exist, but we'll go with these competitors, is not necessarily the case, because, again, there's a reason that the other company was growing and adding customers on, and they weren't going directly to you. There's a reason you saw value in that company from a growth standpoint. So you have to look at that. You have to look at the traffic source, the revenue source in terms of new business. And the same thing goes, just like Joel was mentioning, in terms of communication. So I would look at it on the CRM side. How are we actually managing, segmenting? What data do we have? And how does that data, if we are going to combine, let's say, CRMs, how is that data going to mesh or gel, especially if we're using two different technologies? So I think there's certainly a way that you can consolidate websites, but it's not always the best solution. In fact, I would venture to say, if you could, without knowing all the details of the company, if you could and you could afford to do it, I would continue to maintain two websites, because there's only 10 results on Google, right? So if both websites are showing up in number 1, number 2 positions for the searches and the keywords that you're trying to show up for, even on the paid side, right? There's only 4 paid results on the first page. So it looks like maybe you have 2 separate budgets, 2 separate strategies, but if you're able to do it effectively, you're not only driving the same, if not more, volume of traffic, leads, conversions, you're actually eliminating and taking more market share away from your competition, because you're taking up more real estate from an advertising standpoint.
And Taylor, it's so interesting you brought that up about, do I have the bigger company website just take over because they're bigger versus the smaller company? Let's go back to that, one of the first questions that Brad asked about inventory of systems. You don't just do an inventory of systems, you do an inventory of projects as well. What are all the projects that these companies have in place today? What's the budget for each one? What's the investment going forward? What are the resources? What's the time? What's the goal? There's no doubt that 2 companies have dozens and dozens of projects that may overlap each other. So the inventory of systems to gain the efficiencies and the synergy and the accretive value also has to do with the projects themselves. So when you do the inventory of systems, also remember to do the inventory of projects and have that governance team identify those. Then you could have some intelligent conversations. This website stays, this one doesn't stay, they both stay, here's why, and what are the projects to keep those going. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, the future projects, right, too, because we've had two different scenarios. One, the software company was a client of ours that was acquired by a larger software company, direct competitor, and the competitor had a lot more customers, maybe 5 times more customers. But our company was just a younger company. Our client, right, was a younger company. So they actually had a better technology. They had a better website. They had a better lead generation system. And so upon that merger, we did a similar process to what we're talking about here. And we decided that, hey, if we're going to merge websites, we're going to do the opposite of what you would think. And we're actually going to move to the lesser known brand because it has better technology. It has less future projects costs to catch up to this technology. And on the marketing side, we actually have more brand equity because of the marketing that's been done, even though the other company has more revenue, right, in the short term. And then go ahead.
I was going to bring that up as well. You beat me to it, but really well said, Taylor. Just because they're the acquiring company and they probably have more money and they are possibly larger, doesn't mean that they're always better with everything. So as Brad said, that inventory of systems and projects and future projects are critical to valuation. And stuff like something that's proprietary but could work across all companies that are being put together or integrated is key. Patents that you may hold could be super valuable to someone that is acquiring that doesn't have something like that. So it works in reverse as well. And I've seen a lot of smaller companies acquire larger companies with private equity or family office behind them for those very reasons.
All right. Well, with all the merging and acquiring that's going on, oftentimes there's going to be multiple organizations, which means multiple locations. What considerations need to be made and steps need to be taken when you're dealing with organizations that have multiple locations?
Steve, I think that's all you.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes beyond telecom. It goes into obviously office lease space, what you have inside your office in terms of copiers, computers, data, networking, et cetera, down to food and coffee services. But definitely back to telecom and what you mentioned earlier, Brad, about what contractual obligations do people have, how critical that is, because we have a company right now, a huge client of ours that started 5 years ago, 30 million in revenue. They're approaching 2 billion already. And obviously that's not all organic growth. It's lots of acquisitions of bigger businesses. And in parts of the Midwest, they have AT&T and Sprint. Out on the coast, the East Coast, it's all Verizon. There's some other stuff with these smaller telcos. And how do they streamline it and get it all together? And although they'd like to give us all the services so it's under one private network seamlessly, there's contractual obligations that have to be met. So in those cases, they look at if there's minimum annual revenue commitments in those contracts, and can they step down to the minimums and start increasing stuff with us over time. So that's speaking specifically telecom services related. When it comes to other things like rent or real estate that's owned, again, back to this due diligence and doing the data warehousing. Every single piece of this is so critical to maximizing your economies of scale once it's all put together. And that ultimately determines the end valuation of the acquisition.
So, I mean, I can speak from a marketing standpoint on top of Steve's points there. I think it really just depends on the business model. If the multiple locations matter, I mean, we've seen, like, let's say manufacturing companies acquire or merge, and then one of the reasons they acquired that is really because of the customer base. So, but they have a larger facility. They're going to do all the production, manufacturing all in their own facility, maybe shut that down or at least lessen the amount of work that's going to be done out of the acquired facility. So I would just look at it from a marketing standpoint and look at the customers, right? Does it matter where you're located? Is that the reason that they're working with you, right? So if it is manufacturing related, obviously things like logistics and shipping considerations need to be taken into consideration there in terms of, does it matter that we're located in Chicago, or does it matter that we're located in San Diego, or can we do all of our production out of sort of a neutral site? And so from a marketing standpoint, the way that you could look at that is look at your analytics, look at where the traffic, look at where the leads are coming from, and then look at just the messaging that you have, right? If your messaging is, locally owned, Chicago-based, packaging company, you can't, do that if you're doing all of your, production out of Mexico, right? So whatever that scenario is, I would just say, does your physical location matter to your customers and matter in your marketing efforts? If not, then there's probably not a ton of consideration that would need to be taken on the marketing side.
That leads, unless you don't want me jumping ahead to another topic that plays into all this.
No, go for it.
It leads me to one other thing that can be critical to this process is the culture. And Taylor, you talk about Chicago. People from other countries, and there's a lot of acquirers coming in from China and the UK and other places wanting to do more business in the United States. And I would assume that they think it's the United States. Well, we know working in the United States that the Midwest is very different from the West Coast, is very different from the East Coast in terms of culture, right? And here's a perfect example. Even domestically, we sold our business to a company in California, and it turned out that our Midwest homegrown culture that we were so proud of was so foreign to these surfers in California who it took so long for them to understand the Midwest, and it took so long for the Midwesterners to understand how this California culture works. And it was very disruptive the first 2 years in the integration with employees. And I don't like the way this guy does this, or, wow, we could really learn from this person because they do it this way. But it's just throwing a little caution to the wind here that here's another example, made in the United States, or how about your contact center? It's offshore, it's in India, it's in the...
Uh-oh, we may have lost Steve for a second, but let me just follow up on what he said when he talked about culture. It's probably the number one reason why any merger or acquisition succeeds or fails. Any study that you could read on, from Harvard Business Study or any organization will tell you, it's all about culture. As the saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. That's the saying. So culture, which is what Steve was about to say, was how do people react when other people do things differently? And it all comes down to your overall business processes. And when you ask somebody from the West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, South, North, it doesn't make a difference. Because you always ask the question, how do you do it? And then why do you do it that way? Well, the answer on why you do it that way is always because I've always done it that way. The challenge is to improve those processes, challenge why they do it that way, not to break the culture, but to improve that culture so everyone's on the same page. So when you put two companies together, your business processes are different. And then you get the opportunity to ask the question, why do you do it that way? So it's a great way to improve the culture.
I think I would welcome back Steve. I think that was a great point there. And yeah, I think I would add that into everything else that we talked about of, when we're taking inventory of technologies, when we're talking about, lead generation efforts, we're talking about everything. So we're looking at the locations, like you mentioned, the culture, in asking a question of how do we do this and why do we do it that way? I've seen that from let's say a tech stack evaluation or inventory as well of we're just looking at a list of line items and it's not the right people in the room making those cuts because they're not the one using that technology, right? It's like, I don't know why we're paying this bill, so let's cut that or let's cut this. So that culture, you need to kind of understand too, who's doing the job, why is that important to them, why is that process important to them, all the way to, just like we're talking about the messaging, the branding, how we present ourselves as an organization. I think you have to really ask the people that are doing the work on the front lines, not just the group of senior leadership in the boardroom there of well, here's our new culture and here's our new technologies that we're using and here's how we're going to operate. And it's like an arranged kind of forced marriage there between two organizations that you might lose a lot of employees, you might lose a lot of that culture that was the reason why you're successful in the first place.
I like the analogy of the arranged marriage. That's totally appropriate.
Absolutely.
So
go ahead, Brad.
Sorry, go ahead, Taylor.
No, I was just going to say, I know we're kind of running short on time here, so to just wrap it up, I'm not sure if anyone else had any final thoughts on, I guess, considerations or issues that, you've helped, clients or companies through within a merger or acquisition.
I did a podcast a few years ago, and I put a challenge at the end of that. That's when I was investing in small businesses and doing some angel investing. And I would just, not a challenge, but put it out there that I'm always available for someone to pick my brain. It gets to a point where, and Joel, I'm sure with your firm, you can understand this, where free consulting only goes so far. And then it's okay, if you want to engage with me, we have to come up with some kind of agreement. But just shared experiences. If anyone has questions, feel free to share my contact information. I'm always excited to talk to people about opportunities and share what I've done.
Absolutely agree with that, Steve. Anytime. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, but from a marketing standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, I do think a lot of times in that due diligence process is, for whatever reason, is overlooked. And it's not that bad decisions are made, and that a lot of times it's not that they're investing into bad companies or anything like that. It's kind of the opposite, that I believe that they undervalue some of that pieces that is there from a marketing standpoint, from a lead generation standpoint, from a brand standpoint. And you really never realize that the mistake was made because nothing really happened. You just don't see that growth potential that was there before. So I think just getting involved in that, it could be, pre-merger, pre-acquisition, or even just immediately after, before we start slashing departments or slashing technologies, certainly, as Steve mentioned, available for any kind of consultation there. All right, absolutely. We appreciate everybody joining today, and we'll certainly, as Steve mentioned, provide everyone's contact information and website where, if you are looking for assistance with your organization, where to find either Coeo Solutions, LTA, or OneIMS.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
really appreciate it. Great
Enjoyed it. Thank you so much.